Welcome to the CA3 Climate Action and Advocacy on the Airwaves podcast. My name is Simon Evans and I welcome you. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the University of Calgary's Mobilizing Alberta Climate Action Grant Program. We are broadcasting on 90.9 FM CJSW in Calgary. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. I hope you enjoy your time here on the airwaves as we dive into the world of climate action. On the horizon, an ominous black cloud could be seen approaching, and it was moving quickly. Gale-force winds ripped across the cracked and barren landscape as the dark wall grew by the minute. Soon, the sun was blotted out, turning day into night, leaving only a faint, eerie orange glow. Reaching hundreds of kilometers wide and thousands of meters into the sky, this was no ordinary storm. As it moved closer, the dry air began to charge with static electricity in a foreboding prelude. Before they knew it, it was upon them. Instead of bringing the relief of much-needed rain to the parched land, it carried a suffocating mass of dust, dirt, and sand. Families huddled indoors in fear as the towering mass engulfed their homes, their farmland, and their livestock. Residents attempted to shield windows and doorways while wrapping their heads in wet towels to protect themselves from the choking grit that found its way through every crack and crevice. Those brave enough to venture outside faced sandpaper-like winds that completely obscured the roads and stripped the paint from their vehicles. With no refuge, cattle were blinded, inhaling dust and running in panicked circles before finally collapsing with mud-caked lungs. Already failing crops were destroyed, leaving millions unemployed, hungry, and homeless. The black blizzard had arrived. While this may sound like an apocalyptic science fiction story, these were actual events experienced by those living in southern Alberta and other areas of the Great Plains across North America in the 1930s. Known as the Dustbowl, these devastating dust storms are the reason this decade came to be known as the Dirty 30s. This crisis was rooted in a combination of natural factors and unsustainable human activities. Prolonged drought, coupled with the widespread cultivation of marginal lands, and poor farming practices such as monocropping and over-tillage led to massive soil erosion along with the depletion of essential nutrients. As farmers plowed the prairie grasses which had evolved over eons and served to anchor the soil, the land became vulnerable to the relentless winds that swept across the region. These factors led to one of the greatest environmental, social, and economic disasters in Canadian history, emphasizing the need for sustainable land management practices and climate-resilient agricultural strategies. Namely, practices that have been employed successfully by Indigenous peoples in Canada for thousands of years. Agricultural landowners were offered some respite from the harsh conditions found in the prairies through a now-defunct federal program that provided farmers with seedlings to grow protective rows of trees around homesteads and exposed cropland known as shelterbelts. These shelterbelts help to trap and retain needed moisture, prevent soil erosion, enhance crop growing conditions, and protect communities from the elements. With a narrow focus on short-term economic security, First Nations communities were excluded from this program as their land ownership status prevented them from application. Because reserve land is technically owned by the Crown, there was no opportunity to fill out township, range, and home quarter information as was required. With increasing instances of severe drought and other extreme weather events linked to climate change, Siksika Nation in southern Alberta is now taking matters into their own hands. With the help of local partnerships, they have embarked on a determined mission to plant and grow their own shelter belts. Hello and welcome to Climate Action and Advocacy on the Airwaves. My name is Simon Evans and I'm a Master of Social Work student at the University of Calgary. Today, I would like to tell you a story about climate leadership, resilience, and collaboration in the face of unprecedented challenges. Before getting into details of the Siksika Nation Shelterbelt project, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about what has led to this point. The world is getting warmer, and Alberta is no exception. Let's briefly get into the nitty-gritty. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report, or IPCC, global surface temperatures have risen by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. The IPCC also asserts that global warming is unequivocally the result of human activity through the emission of greenhouse gases. While a rise of just over 1 degree globally may not seem like much, it is significant as it takes an enormous amount of energy to heat the world's oceans, atmosphere, and land masses. Things are not slowing down. The annual 2023 Global Climate Report by the National Centers for Environmental Information states that the average annual temperature increase per decade across the planet over the last 174 years has more than tripled since 1982. Not only that, but 10 of the warmest years in the historical record have occurred in the past decade, with 2023 breaking all previous records. While these figures are representative of global averages, not all parts of the world are experiencing global warming to the same degree. The average annual temperature in Canada has seen increases at roughly twice that of the global mean, with Alberta having warmed by more than 2 degrees since 1951. Projections indicate that warming in the province will continue well above the global rate. What does this mean for Alberta? While some may relish the idea of shorter, milder winters, I can't say I haven't been guilty of having some of these thoughts. The negative consequences for our natural environment, industry, economy, and the health and welfare of the people who live here are already being felt, and by all indications will only continue to get worse. Regardless of how you feel about it, Alberta relies on the annual snowfall for much of its water supply. Warmer, shorter winters means there's less time for snow to accumulate that is essential to replenish our rivers, lakes, and provide the moisture so vital to soil conditions when it melts in the spring. Snowpacks in the mountains are also in decline, which are necessary to keep adequate supplies of water flowing through the summer in the form of runoff. While climate models suggest that global warming will increase precipitation during the winter and spring months, it will be in the form of rain rather than snow, leading to increased instances of flooding. At the same time, a decrease is expected during the summer months when it is needed most. To a province that is already highly susceptible to drought, this is bad news. Combine this with an expected surge in severe weather events, and we have a recipe for disaster. The effects of these conditions are already evident to Albertans who have experienced record-setting heat waves, cold snaps, floods, droughts, and instances of wildfires across the province in recent years. Although farming practices in the prairies have improved somewhat through approaches such as reduced tilling and the planting of cover crops, Alberta still sits on a knife's edge of water supply and demand. Increased industrial and agricultural demand combined with warming trends and drier than usual conditions have pushed this essential resource to its limit. Glacier melt is one of the last lines of defense against drought in the province, but this is not a sustainable contingency plan, as sadly, many of Alberta's glaciers are expected to completely disappear over the course of the next decade. According to the January 2024 Alberta Environment and Protected Areas Report on Drought and Risk Management, we are now in Stage 4 of its 5-stage water shortage emergency response plan. As of April 2024, there are 51 water shortage advisories currently in effect, and over a dozen counties in Alberta declared an agricultural disaster last summer due to drought. Many reservoirs across the province are at historic lows, with some even falling below the level of intake valves, forcing some municipalities to spend up to $1 million hauling their water in by truck. At the same time, the province is planning to move ahead with close to $1 billion plan to upgrade Alberta's irrigation system, which begs the question, where will the water to be used in these systems be coming from? All signs point to an unprecedented summer of drought this year. and this is likely just the beginning. Who will this affect? The short answer is everybody, but will it affect everybody to the same extent? The even shorter answer is no. The World Health Organization states that health risks due to climate change disproportionately affect vulnerable and disadvantaged populations as social determinants of health, such as livelihood, access to health care, and social support structures are undermined. Sadly, it is often those least responsible for environmental degradation and climate change that bear the most serious exposures to its harms, while simultaneously having fewer resources to cope and recover from their impacts. Among those most likely to be negatively affected by climate change in Alberta are the Indigenous communities who live here, and they're not sitting by idly. Not only does climate change pose a serious health risk to these original inhabitants, but also to their food security and constitutionally protected rights to hunt, fish, and engage in traditional practices and ceremonies. For millennia, the Indigenous peoples of Canada and around the globe have lived in balance with the natural world. Their deep connection to the land, waters, and to the ecosystem have informed their culture, languages, and livelihoods. It is because of this intergenerational relationship, experience, and knowledge that they were among the first to sound the climate alarm bells. Indigenous nations have been raising their voices for decades now, drawing attention to changing species migration, water levels, and weather patterns. They have placed their lives on the line in the face of unrelenting industrial resource extraction and land degradation, while suffering for generations under devastating colonial policies and practices, such as residential schools and forced sterilization. At a recent conference on racial justice in Calgary, an Indigenous elder joked that they were property of the Crown. If not the people themselves, their lands and the resources on them are certainly treated that way. In fact, the true history of Canada reveals that the people were treated far worse. They were considered a problem that needed to be eradicated. Enshrined in the Indian Act passed in 1876 were systemic policies of assimilation that stripped Aboriginal peoples of their language, culture, and traditions, continuing to this day with few amendments. Despite these challenges, Indigenous voices are starting to be heard, as scientific evidence has begun to confirm what they already knew. It is also their ancestral knowledge and holistic worldview based on interconnectedness and reciprocity that may be the key to providing a pathway to adaptation, resilience, and ultimately restoring balance to our planet before it's too late. The changing climate in Alberta has not gone unnoticed by members of Siksika Nation. In a recent CBC article, an Indigenous knowledge keeper commented on the receding river levels that elders have connected to reduced runoff from the mountains as there's been less annual snowfall. Others emphasized that their lands have never been so dry and that gale force winds in recent years have blown the roofs off of some of their homes. It is because of this growing concern for the environment and the well-being of their community that they have initiated their own shelterbelt program to cope with the effects of climate change. Partnering with Project Forest, a non-profit organization dedicated to rewilding local landscapes in Alberta, Siksika Nation plans to plant over 130,000 trees, which will create close to 50 kilometers of new shelter belts. Not only will these shelter belts protect the community and its land from extreme weather and provide privacy, but will create access to spaces for traditional practices such as berry picking. This nature-based intervention will also reduce the effects of climate change by trapping moisture and capturing carbon with the most efficient technology currently known: trees. The inclusion of food and medicine forests will also provide additional benefits to the community, such as sustainable access to food sources, a cleaner and healthier environment, greater biodiversity, and even economic opportunities through sustainable agriculture and project employment. This project is also supported by agricultural experts and local business partnerships that share the same vision and values. It is important to note that the success of projects like these rely on the direction of Indigenous peoples themselves, having the ancestral knowledge and local understanding of the issues that need to be addressed. Having corresponded with Project Forest, it was clear how important community engagement with Siksika Nation was in developing and implementing a plan that truly meets the needs of this community. Nature-based solutions have been a catchphrase in the climate strategy efforts lately, and for good reason. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands have the potential to capture and store vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. There has been increasing recognition of the important role Indigenous peoples can play in nature-based solutions to this crisis. But Western colonial implementation of plans and policies can reproduce structural inequalities and injustices. Lena Dominelli, a leading voice in the social implications of climate disaster, has long warned that even well-meaning responses can become oppressive if community wishes, cultural sensitivities, and local traditions are ignored by larger power structures. For example, simply building more irrigation capacity will only put more pressure on Alberta's dwindling water supply, leaving even less for rural and Indigenous communities. Sadly, Canada's record of fulfilling commitments to both climate action and Indigenous rights has been sorely lacking. In terms of climate, Canada has failed to meet any of its climate targets in the last 30 years and has been the worst performer among G7 nations in this regard. Statistics from Climate Watch in 2020 rank Canada as the 11th largest contributor to greenhouse gases, while being the second highest per capita in the world. Despite a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, Canada is projected to produce more oil by then than it did in 2019. How are we doing when it comes to Indigenous rights? In 2007, Canada was one of only 5 countries to vote against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, based largely on opposition to land rights, self-determination, and informed consent. While it was finally officially adopted in 2016, it appears that rhetoric is still outweighing any meaningful action. A 2022 article titled Towards Indigenous Visions of Nature-Based Solutions, an Exploration into Canadian Federal Climate Policy, concluded that while current Canadian climate policy contains increasingly aspirational language, they ultimately failed to support Indigenous sustainable self-determination as required by commitments to the Paris Agreement and UNDRIP. The paper further contends that without clear protection of Indigenous rights and jurisdiction, nature-based solutions risk facilitating future violence and land dispossession in the form of climate colonialism. While there is great promise for nature-based solutions to support Indigenous-led economic development, governance, and culture, this possibility remains unlikely under our current style of capitalism that depends on economic and political inequality and the exploitation of both human and natural resources. A recent report by Indigenous Climate Action was highly critical of the process of engagement with Indigenous communities in the development of Canada's most recent climate plans, such as the Pan-Canadian Framework, or PCF, and the Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy, or HEHE. While both documents repeatedly mention Indigenous rights, the need for free, prior, and informed consent, self-determination, and a call for robust engagement, there was no substantive action towards inclusion of Indigenous peoples in their development. Words like engagement, recommendations, input, considerations, and contributions mean very little when national Indigenous organizations, or NIOs, were not included in any real decision-making, having been excluded from formal working groups in the development of the PCF. Instead, they were treated in the same fashion as other interest groups or stakeholders, rather than sovereign entities with the right to self-government. Consultation in this sense merely becomes a tick box that creates the illusion of partnership, where Indigenous rights are recognized only to the extent that it does not disrupt colonial power relations. Examination of the HEHE shows no evidence of any consultation with NIOs or transparency as to how or by who it was developed. Additionally, token consultation with Indigenous groups does not constitute free, prior, and informed consent, especially when there is no clarity on how their recommendations would be incorporated. As with the National Shelterbelt Program and countless other instances, Indigenous communities were once again structurally excluded, this time from decision-making tables in the process of developing these climate plans. Without Indigenous leadership, consent, and full participation in these plans, nature-based solutions are likely to become a new greenwashed version of carbon offsets that justify the continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels while potentially opening the door to land grabs that further displace Indigenous communities in the name of conservation. Indigenous peoples continue to lead social movements for climate and environmental justice and defend their lands and waters from ongoing colonial encroachment and extractive development. Despite the many attempts to criminalize these acts of resistance through the willingness of courts to issue injunctions that protect corporate interests, Indigenous communities continue to fight for environmental protections and solutions for the benefit of all people. While media tends to focus on more dramatic events like demonstrations or blockades, simple acts like planting trees and moving away from fossil fuel dependency through small, local projects is another kind of resistance. In fact, you may be surprised to hear that there are over 2,000 Indigenous-led projects across Canada focused on renewable energy, sustainable development, and the equitable distribution of resources. The recent release of the Just Transition Guide is a testament to the dedication and tenacity of Indigenous leadership towards these ends. Rather than focusing on band-aid solutions that continue to prop up unsustainable and extractive business practices, this document thoroughly explores new possibilities to transition away from fossil fuel dependency in ways that protect marginalized groups and provide tangible social benefits for all. The Just Transition Guide isn't just wide-eyed cheerleading for anything and everything green. It is a detailed examination of the design, financing, and operation of advanced renewable energy systems and nature-based solutions. By focusing on local actions such as the shelterbelt program in Siksika Nation, Indigenous communities aren't just talking, but demonstrating how sustainable and equitable approaches can help the adaptation to and the mitigation of climate change while creating revenue, employment opportunities, reliable energy supplies, capacity building, and community pride. The rest of Canada needs to pay attention. A question I often ask myself these days is what is progress, and what are we rushing towards? The signs are clear that our current political and economic systems are privileging the few, oppressing the vulnerable, and putting the squeeze on everybody else while destroying the delicate balance needed for all life on this planet. These systems require the impossible equation of endless growth based on finite resources. We've seen the devastating effects that unsustainable practices can have on our health, the environment, and economy as experienced during the Dustbowl of the 1930s. Without a fundamental change to how we relate to and interact with the natural world, we may be destined for far worse. Instead of focusing on the root causes of our current environmental and likely soon-to-be economic crisis, Western-style solutions tend only to the symptoms in the hope that we can carry on with business as usual. There is no magic pill that can cure this predicament. A significant individual and societal lifestyle change is in order. We are at a turning point and in desperate need of Indigenous knowledge and leadership to help teach us to restore our relationship to the natural world and to each other. Powerful examples of local climate action undertaken by Indigenous communities is all around us. We need to understand that all beings, resources, and natural systems are interconnected, interdependent, and precious. We need to realize that profit is not the bottom line, and that collaboration is greater than competition. The potential is there for us to transition to a future that meets the needs of modern society while respecting the natural environment and leaving no one behind. That sounds like progress to me. Thank you for listening to the Climate Action and Advocacy on the Airwaves. We hope you enjoyed your time here. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the University of Calgary's Mobilizing Alberta Climate Action Grant Program. We are broadcasting on 90.9 FM CJSW in Calgary. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the airwaves soon.